Good afternoon. The dog days of summer are upon us in this hottest time of the season. What can parents do to make sure their young children, their babies, stay safe, especially when outside? Dr. Nathan Graber of St. Peter's Pediatrics in Clifton Park is here with some helpful information. Good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon, and happy summer. So I wanted to just start off by saying just how important it is that our kids do spend time outside every single day, and that they get to play and have time outdoors, and it's really important for them to get lots of exercise. So let's start out by talking about how to make sure that they're safe when it gets really hot out. First of all, I want to cover the topic of thermoregulation. How does a child's body maintain the temperature, maintain its temperature for optimal functioning? So there are sort of 5 mechanisms that infants, children, and adolescents use in order to keep their bodies cool when it gets hot outside. That includes radiation, conduction, convection, evaporation, and respiration. So let me just talk about them all really quick because it's important to understand these concepts when we think about how to keep them safe. First of all, we have radiation, conduction, and convection. These are mechanisms by which the body transfers heat into the environment around it, either objects or the air around it, or transfers it across a space. Those only function if the temperature in the surrounding environment is less than the body temperature. If it's the same as the body temperature or more than the body temperature, then the body cannot give off heat. By those mechanisms, it has to use evaporation. Evaporation, we know when we start getting really active on a hot day, we start sweating. And that sweat is mostly water, and that water evaporates off our bodies, and it brings with it that excess amount of heat that's inside the body. And that becomes the most important mechanism for cooling when it gets really hot outside. There are certain factors, though, that can influence the risk for heat illness and heat-related illness on hot days. One of those factors is what the weather's like. And the weather is not just the temperature, but it's also the humidity. And when we put the two together, we get something called the heat index. And that's actually much more important for predicting the risk for heat illness than just the temperature alone. The heat index combines humidity and temperature, and we know that when it's hot and humid, we feel really miserable when we're outside. It doesn't even have to be that hot, just be really humid, and it could have put a lot of stress on the human body. So it's important to understand that concept when making decisions about playing time outside. And a matter of fact, the American Academy of Pediatrics has on its website, healthychild.org, they have a chart that shows the relative humidity versus the temperature and gives the heat index. And I'm sorry, this is not in color. On the website it's in color, and you can use the measurement to then make decisions about when kids should be spending time outdoors and how much time they should spend outdoors, and gives them ideas about the types of risk for heat-related illness. There's a second page to the chart which is available on the website that helps you to interpret what those numbers mean. So other factors that influence a child's risk include, related to the weather, are direct sunlight. So if the sun is shining down on them, that's going to make them much hotter because of the radiant heat from the sun. And also if the wind is blowing, because the wind, if it blows by while you're sweating, it makes you feel a lot cooler. It'll cool your body down a lot quicker. So those are a couple of factors related to the weather, but there's also individual susceptibility. So a healthy child can regulate their temperature much more effectively than a child who has any kind of chronic illness. Certain medications can interfere with those mechanisms of thermoregulation that we just discussed, and we have to take extra caution with certain kids. So, that being said, let's talk about some of the general concepts. One of the general concepts that we always consider when it comes to kids and makes kids very, very different than adults. So for children, they don't necessarily either have the capacity, the ability, or the authority to make decisions about how to modify their activities or their environment when it gets hot outside, and that can actually increase their risk for heat-related illnesses. So let's talk about heat-related illnesses, and let's explain what I mean by that term. I know we've heard of like heat stroke and heat exhaustion and heat cramps. I like to group it all together to kind of simplify things. It's all called heat-related illness. And heat-related illness is when the body isn't able to correct for the higher temperatures that it's that being exposed to. And so we start off with the most mild form of heat-related illness, which is called heat stress. And in heat stress, the child will feel uncomfortable and start sweating and turn red, but their body temperature is still normal. Their body temperature is still within the range of 97.7 degrees and 99.5, which is normal range of temperature for a child. And the next level of severity is heat exhaustion. In heat exhaustion, those thermoregulatory mechanisms start breaking down, and the child's body temperature starts to increase. When that happens, there's thirst, increase in thirst. A child could have a headache, nausea and vomiting, dizziness, weakness, or fainting even. And that's heat exhaustion. And the body's temperature can be as high as 104 degrees in heat exhaustion. Heat exhaustion is a sign that worse things are on the way. So once you see any of those signs in a child who's either playing outside or in an environment that's very hot, especially when they're overexerting themselves, it's important for them to take a break and get out into a cool area. We'll talk about first aid at the end and how to cool them down. The other types of heat illness, the one that's a life-threatening is called heat stroke. In heat stroke, the thermoregulatory mechanisms are completely broken down. The child's temperature is now out of control. It's above 104 degrees, and we start to have very serious responses inside the body and damage to the body itself. So that is an emergency. And in any case where you're approaching that, or you feel even that the child is getting close to that, it's important to call 911 right away, because that is a medical emergency. So one of the things that happens with heat exhaustion, which is that moderate form, is that kids can be very irritable. But when they get to heat stroke, they become completely irrational and confused. And so you can see that difference. Once you're in that state, it really is a medical emergency. So the other things that happen that we hear about, things like heat rash. Heat rash is a very mild rash that occurs as a result of either being overbundled, which can happen in winter, it can happen in summer, and it can also happen just from the heat outdoors, and it's just a red rash. Usually gets better with just some cool compresses, cool towels soaked in cool water. Heat cramps is probably a misnomer, because cramps can happen any time of year, and it usually happens with exertion, with physical exertion. When that happens, think about the fact that the child probably did not drink enough and has not been drinking enough during that activity. It's often associated with dehydration, and dehydration is a big factor here. Dehydration occurs as a part of heat illnesses, and dehydration greatly increases the risk for heat illness and severe consequences of heat illness. So we're going to talk about drinking in just a minute. So I want to cover a couple of topics, really quickly. One of them, and these are two topics that are very specific to certain age groups. In infants in cars and children in cars, every year we hear about children and infants who have died because they were left in the car on a hot day. The car is an environment, it gets really, really hot very, very quickly. The temperature inside the car can go up very fast. Within 30 minutes, most of the temperature increase has occurred once a car's been left totally with the windows closed and all locked up. And it doesn't even take that high a temperature for this to occur. We'll talk a little. Let's talk a little bit about the issue of the infant in cars, and I don't want to go into too much detail why it happens, but I'll just tell you that most of the time when there are sort of two circumstances where kids die in cars. One is those infants left in car seats. The parents forget about them. It's usually completely an accident. They didn't think about it, and for whatever reason, maybe a change in routine, put the child in the car seat and then drive to work instead of the daycare, and go about your day and completely forget that you had the child in the car. In those circumstances, what is generally what recommended in terms of prevention to stop that from happening is think about putting some object next to the child when you put them in the car seat as part of the routine, something that you definitely need, something like your keys, your wallet, your phone, your pocketbook, your shoe, something that you definitely, when you get out of the car, you're going to think about, oh, where are my keys? Oh wait, I only have one shoe on. I'm going to go back in the car, and then you'll remember that the child's there. I know it may sound a little absurd, but it is something that really does happen, and we should take it very, very seriously. The other thing is children who play in cars and then get themselves trapped. Either they put the seatbelt on and can't figure out how to get it off, or they lock the doors and can't figure out how to unlock them and get trapped inside cars. So really, especially during the summer, when you get out of your car, lock the doors. And that'll prevent children from going into the car and playing and getting either heat illness or even dying from being trapped inside the car. The other group of kids that I wanted to focus on are adolescents. Adolescents participate in school sports, and they also sometimes get jobs for the summer, which both of which are really excellent things for kids to do. But what can happen is, especially with school sports, which practices usually start late in the summer, is that you have a child who has been very active in sports, but then they stop at the end of let's say the football season, and then they have a couple of months of break from workouts, and then they start again in August without acclimatizing to the hotter temperatures. And not only that, but they may have a lot of athletic equipment on them, and maybe be getting pushed by adults, either the coach or their friends or other kids, to work beyond what their body is capable of handling. And so those kids are really at high risk for heat-related illness. There's a lot of great information available from professional organizations. So as a parent, you should be checking with the coach to make sure that they're working to condition the kids and get them ready for an increase in play and intense activity before they go out and start the season. The American Academy of Pediatrics also has an example, and this one I'm just going to look here is from the National Athletic Trainers Association, and this is an example of a protocol for conditioning adolescent athletes back into play after they've taken time off and come back to the field in the hottest part of the year. So I talked about those. Let's talk a little bit more about prevention. I want to talk about all kids kind of prevention. First of all, during the summer, it's important that kids wear light-colored, loose-fitting clothing, preferably of a material that lets water evaporate very quickly, doesn't trap it in, because if that sweat gets trapped against their body and doesn't evaporate, then it's going to trap all that heat in. It's preventing that additional mechanism called evaporation from cooling the body. The other thing is drink. Every child should have a refillable water bottle. Hold on one second, I think I have one here. Okay, so every child should have a refillable water bottle. Before the beginning of the day, they should get hydrated and be drinking. They should carry the water bottle with them when they're out and active, and they should be given breaks and times when they can drink. And make sure that they're staying well hydrated. For the athlete, it's important for them to maintain not just their water but also electrolytes. So it's good to have either a low calorie or no calorie sports drink that they can drink before practice and during practice and after practice. And stay well hydrated throughout the entire day of practicing. The other thing that I want to talk about is air conditioning. We know that air conditioning is protective. Even a small amount or some time in air conditioning every day during the summer will help them to cool their body down for a while and get them through the day with less risk of getting heat illness. And then when it really gets hot out, when there's a warning that there's going to be a heat wave there, try to limit the most intense activities to the earliest part of the day or late in the evening, so this way they're not out and overexerting themselves during the hottest part of the day. And one other thing for prevention, just reminder, since they're going to be outside during the summer, remember that they should put on a sunblock that is at least SPF 30, that is broad spectrum, that is either designed specifically for sports or for water and is applied at least 30 minutes before they engage in the activity. So this way it gets a chance to soak into the skin and protect them from the UV rays. So what happens if your child does get heat illness? If they have a mild or beginning of a moderate heat illness and you recognize that they're just like overheated, they're a little bit irritable, maybe even nauseous and vomiting, the first thing you have to do is get them to a cool place. Get them in the shade. If you can get them to an air-conditioned environment, that would be ideal. Start cooling them down. Get that wet clothes off their body. Get some cool water that you can either apply with towels to their neck, to their head, to their face, to their body, and try to get it to evaporate off. One of the things that we recommend for infants is actually taking a spray bottle with some water and a fan to try to encourage evaporation and cooling through convection as well. And so that would be that's the first thing, is just cooling. For adolescents, they can take a cool shower as long as they're not fainting every time they stand up. If you have a child who is not getting better from the immediate first aid, it's important you have to call 911 because we don't want them to progress to heat stroke, which is a life-threatening condition. So pay attention to that. If they're nauseous and vomiting, encourage them to drink small sips of a sports drink that does have sugar in it, because the cycle of vomiting and then getting nauseous and then vomiting more and getting nauseous is a downward spiral, and an electrolyte drink with lots of water and a little bit of sugar is going to help them to overcome that quicker than straight water. If all you have is water, then do little sips of water and as you're cooling them down. So that's what I wanted to talk about today in terms of heat illness. I want everybody to have a safe and fun and happy summer.